Hey, how we doing? Good. Starting here in a couple minutes, so please find a seat here soon, and we'll give folks a few more minutes to settle in. You might want to go down a little bit. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. And to those watching on CSB TV and Channel 20 and on the county's Facebook page. If you know anyone who could not be here or watch the live stream, video will be available after tonight's broadcast on Facebook and on the YouTube channel. I'd like to start out tonight thanking Joe Black from the Independent Living Resource Center, who's providing tonight's American Sign Language interpretation. We also have Spanish interpreters set up in the back of the room. Please check in with them if you want to get a headset. So, with a light rain as our backdrop and a flood advisory emergency alert from Mr. Lewin, tonight you're going to hear about watershed impacts resulting from the Thomas Fire and the resulting 1/9 debris flow. Also, you're going to hear about the current conditions of the watershed from the U.S. Forest Service Burn Area Emergency Response Team, known as BEAR, and also the CAL FIRE Watershed Emergency Response Team, or the WERT team. The county and partnering agencies will use this expert findings in conjunction with other resources to plan for potential future rain events that might be dangerous to us post-fire conditions on our local watersheds. You also learn about FEMA's process for developing new flood hazard maps that are due to be released next month and how they inform the county's land rebuilding process. We also have a FEMA National Flood Insurance representative here tonight to answer a few questions. Following the presentations, we'll open it up to questions. County staff from our Flood Control, Office of Emergency Management, our Planning Department are here to answer specific questions based upon their areas of expertise. And before we start the presentations, I'd like to welcome Chair of the Board of Supervisors, Doss Williams.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And this is on the heels of the release of both the BEAR and WERT reports. And of course, it's before we will see the FEMA hazard mapping. What I want to do as someone who lives in the red zone, like many of you, I do want to temper maybe some of the hopes that I had that are a little dashed by these reports. I was hoping that, as is normal in these type of reports, that there would be mitigations, and there are, but that these mitigations would be some effective silver bullets to prevent or reduce the likelihood of further slides. Those preventative measures of that level of effectiveness are not in these reports. So that means we're going to have another season. And that's can be a daunting thing. But what can be presented tonight and what is in those reports is some pretty useful information about what is the state of things, what kind of thinking goes into emergency planning. It was very reassuring to me, as much as I deeply trust Rob Lewin and the Sheriff's Department. It's really good to know that they don't just, throw darts at dartboards, right? They're doing this with a lot of experts and ologists of various types, and so that was reassuring. And I think also, even knowing what preventative measures aren't going to work help us narrow the options and measures that the county can take into the future. In narrowing measures that we can take in the foothills, and sort of dashing some of our hopes on that, thank you for that, that means that we really have to turn to things that we could do in channel, debris basins, and in the channels themselves. I also, before I want to turn this back over to Matt, I want to recognize that we have a few folks who have been, one in particular representing Salud Carbajal, Wendy Mota. Salud has been a great partner in dealing especially with FEMA. So thank you, Wendy, for being here. And we have a couple planning commissioners here, one from Montecito Planning Commission, Donna Senauer, and Deborah Schwartz from the City of Santa Barbara's Planning Commission. So thank them for being here. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Matt.
So let's get started. We want to leave as much time as possible for questions at the end. And also, please note that the BEAR and the WIRT reports are going to be available at readysbc.gov. And it's up there on the screen as well, the website. We will also be posting tonight's presentations there, so you don't need to take extensive notes. You can go and look them up later if you like. So our first speaker tonight is Kevin Cooper from the U.S. Forest Service, who is the liaison for the Burned Area Emergency Response Team. And if Kevin, you want to come on up?
Thank you, Matt. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening. That rain coming down, we were just talking about that this morning, and it's good to see that. We need that, just not too much of it at once. My name is Kevin Cooper, and I am the BEAR Team Burned Area Emergency Response Team Leader and Liaison for the Los Padres National Forest. So the BEAR Team, let me get this, there we go. So what is BEAR? It's a program to identify imminent post-wildfire threats to human life and safety, property, and critical natural or cultural resources on federal land and take immediate actions to manage unacceptable risk. So what that means is we're looking at areas that have just burned and prior to any damaging rains that are coming in and assessing what those impacts are, those hazards are from different rainfall events. As we saw in this case, they can be quite dangerous. From the federal side of it, we're assessing the entire burned area. We're working with the state team, and Len's going to talk to you later from the WIRT team about how they tie in with us. And we work with a very large group of people to do this assessment very rapidly. And in this case, it was very important to be quite fast with this. When it comes to the treatments afterwards, we are working primarily, of course, on Forest Service lands, and all the other landowners work on their properties that they manage. So obviously, after you lose all this vegetation, the issue here is we get a lot of erosion. And this is a picture of Cold Springs Canyon after the 1/9 rain event. You can see all the intense amount of erosion that took place. A lot of that soil is moving down into those channels. Of course, when it moves down into the channels, it sometimes moves into areas where we don't want it. This is Jameson Lake. It's a water supply lake for Montecito, and as you can see, it's quite filled now with sediment and other pollutants from that fire itself. We also get a large increase in the amount of water flow that comes off these slopes. It's just there's not absorption of the water, and it moves very quickly downstream, and you get a lot of flooding that could take place during heavy rains. We've talked about rockfall. When that vegetation is burned off the slopes, it's not holding the rock and the soil in place anymore, and that dry gravel will start to come down. You saw it on the roads probably behind Montecito, and it still continues to move downhill. until that vegetation is reestablished. And of course, the most dangerous of all conditions post-fire would be a debris flow, where we have very heavy rainfall events that moves that soil, mixes it into a cement-like mix, which is very viscous, and then it can pick up and move boulders and move those downstream. And that is what we saw on 1/9. It takes a very high intensity rainstorm for that to happen. It's just not the total amount of rain, but it's that intensity. So it has to be, you know, 1.5 inches per hour or about that. Even less can cause that. But the point is, it's the intensity of the rainfall, not the total amount. So it was 282,000 acres, the largest fire in California. You can see a picture from space as that smoke blew over town here in December. Forest Service lands are 161,000 acres. Most of the Forest Service land is on the ridge behind us and to the east. Almost a third of the county is managed by the Los Padres National Forest. There's also state land and private land in there. So our timeline, we started the bear team for the Forest Service on December 5th, right after the fire started. And of course, we were focused down in the Ojai and Ventura area, and we did an assessment for those areas, those dangerous burn slopes above Ojai at that time and presented to them. Len Nielsen came from the work team and joined in with us, and we started making plans with Santa Barbara County and with the state team to work on this fire as quickly as we could. It's December, it's burning rapidly, we don't know where the end is going to be, but we know we're potentially right up against the rainy season. So we started assessing the soil conditions immediately, and we set up a team that worked through the holidays to follow that black side of the fire up to the end and have all the information ready for the final teams that came in on January 3rd. Of course, January 3rd was fairly close to January 9th. We worked quite rapidly to get our information together. What the Forest Service does primarily is work on the soil burn severity map. That's how hot that soil burned, and that is one of the key conditions that changes with a fire that we need to know to do all the other hazard mapping. We establish the watershed response. We look at the threats to the values at risk. Those values at risk, of course, are homes and roads and anything else that might be at risk from these events. We propose those treatments, and we develop a bear report that's going to be available for you online. And it's a rapid assessment. It has to be done 7 days after containment. This is not a full-on scientific study. This is something we're trying to get done very rapidly and have done before these damaging rains. Here's some pictures of the soil burn severity. Well, on the left, we'll see some light soil burn severity. There's not much heat that's been imparted, so it's leaving organic matter, it's leaving seeds. And as you move to the right, in wooded areas where there's intense heat, it burns very deeply into that soil and becomes more erodible. A lot of the country here was chaparral, and it was burned off, but it didn't impart that much heat. It's enough to cause a lot of issues, but not as much heat as can be imparted from wooded areas. So that's a good thing. It didn't erode as much as it could have. We work with the U.S. Geologic Survey and produce a debris flow hazard map. This is based on our soil burn severity map. And as you can see here, there's red lines on there that represent a high risk of a large debris flows. And this is what came out about January 3rd. So from that area, we can tell with, on the bottom left, you can't really read that, but it says for a 15-minute rainfall of 28 millimeters per hour. That's a little over 1 inch per hour. So that's what this map is based on. If we have a rain of just for 15 minutes long that is at that high rate, we can expect this kind of response. So there's a lot of red in there. It caused a lot of concern, of course.
And can you show them Montecito parking?
Yes. If you have one, does this have a, it does. Can you see the green? Okay, so the left side of here is the Montecito area, right on that finger of the burn. So all those red areas are Cold Springs and San Ysidro, Romero, all the canyons that had debris flows. Thanks. So we had a geologist, and we do this assessment for debris flows and rockfall and rock slides. Over here on this left side, you see the debris flows that come out of our channels. And that's different, of course, than the rotational landslides, these larger landslides like La Conchita. A lot of folks asked about La Conchita slide, if it was going to suddenly let go in that first rain. That's not what we would expect, because it takes deep saturation of the soil through many rainfall events for that to happen. And we're not seeing that this year, so it's a different type of event. We have a watershed response. Obviously, flooding and sedimentation were of concern, And there was evidence of past debris flows, and Lynn may talk about this, but there are many debris flows that have happened over the millennia that created this plain that Montecito is built on. And so that creates a problem for us, because when the water emanates from the mountains, it is hitting the top of a rounded slope. And if it occludes with some kind of debris, it's very difficult to tell which way that water is going to go, which way the flood will go with that one. So that makes mapping of these hazards very difficult. We're looking at the road hazard assessment across the area, across the National Forest. Of course, there's many miles of roads. You can see the debris that is gathered on this road, and culverts that can plug and wash out, and indeed that happened. Before we could really get to them on 1-9, we lost a large portion of our roads in the forested land behind here, but also in the front country, as you know. There are a lot of trail impacts too. There's a lot of very important trails across the front country here that people enjoy. But they were very dangerous. They've been closed. And as you can see from just as last week, they're filled in with debris. Even on these steep slopes, they're washed out completely, and the trail essentially doesn't exist. So there's an immense amount of work that needs to be done to open up these trails on this front country. And there is a cooperative group. And Corey, you can say just a moment just to mention that very briefly. Great. So the lower front country trails, there's a great effort underway, a cooperative effort with the Forest Service and other folks. Those trails will be open and allow some access. Thank you, Corey. Okay, so the Forest Service also looks at several other things. I said critical cultural natural resources that we look at, and these are not as important and as immediate a risk as, of course, this front country issues, and that's our prime focus. But we also have a responsibility to look at these critical cultural and natural resources in the backcountry. One of these is the potential invasive plant species that move in after a fire. So we have a process. We have teams coming in to survey for these species that may be arriving from equipment that came to fight this fire. We've done a fisheries assessment, and we'll be continuing that this summer. We have steelhead across the forested area and in the front country, so we're assessing the changes in their habitat and what that effect will be on steelhead. And we also have several endangered wildlife species. You see the California condor there, least-billed vireo, arroyo toad, and red-legged frog. All of these can be affected by the fire. And so we are following those populations and working to see what the effect are on those species, as well as cultural resources. There's a lot of Chumash art and artifacts out there that we're concerned about. Not only the exposure and open to access from the public, but smoke damage and fire damage. So I want to talk a little bit about what we've seen since that fire. This is a picture. It was in January. This is in Upper Cold Springs Canyon. It's me standing there looking across those slopes. You can see how much it's eroded. One of the things we're seeing is, because it's been such a strange year with rainfall, we had very intense hot fire, but a very, very dry fall. We had the rain in January, but it wasn't that much, even though it was very intense, a couple inches. We had extreme drying right after that. And then we had some rain in February, and again, extreme drying. So the plant community has not responded like it normally does. We have not seen that much regrowth. There's been some soil loss. I think there's enough soil up there. There are some seeds up there. We're just not seeing a lot of germination. So this picture was taken 1 week ago. As you can see, there's about 5 or 10% plant recovery on there. So hopefully we get a rain like this. If the plants have germinated, if we get some rain, it will help. But we've got a long ways to go. The meaning of that is that we are in a high-risk situation again, leading into next fall, that rainy season. So we've just not received that good plant growth that we hoped we would. We might see some more, but we're towards the end of our rainy and growth season, so I'm not sure what we'll see. Again, 5 to 10%, this is a different direction. There are some slopes that look better, but there's just not much growth out there. The Forest Service will use our satellite imagery and our crews to go map this out, and we'll be coming back in August about the end of that potential growing season with another report to see where we're at with that one. I don't expect to see a large change between now and then. So there's some plants that are sprouting back. That's chamise on the left, and you can see it sprouting from the root. That's happening out there. There's some deep-rooted plants in the center that's called Mara, manroot. And some of the bird species, of course, are moving back in. There's some recovery taking place. This will happen. It's going to be slow, but it is happening. This is a picture of the Whittier fire to the north, and that's different. It burned in July and August, or July last year. There was some north slope soil moisture that was better, and it got a head start this year, so it was able to use that moisture that did come much better. And so we see recovery rates there of 25 to 50%, much better on the north slope of the Whittier fire. Not as good on the south slope because it's so dry, so there's still a hazard rating that's elevated over there. But we hope to see this recover even more before next rainy season. One of the things that several crews are assessing is the continued potential for debris flows coming out of these canyons above Montecito. On the left, you'll see a channel that's San Ysidro. Obviously, it's been gouged out. A lot of material has been removed. But as you can see on the banks on either side, there's a lot of material still there. And that can crumble and fill back into that channel and be remobilized. So even though an immense amount of material has been moved out of these channels, there's a possibility that more could be mobilized for future debris flows. And there's some very large rocks. That's about a 20-foot boulder. It's kind of perched in the middle there of the canyon. There's also a lot of soil left on the slopes. A lot of it moved down, but there is still a lot of soil left on the slopes. Okay, that's all I have, and I'll pass it to Matt, or there you go. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Kevin. That was a good report. So next we have Len Nielsen with CAL FIRE, who's going to present on the WIRT report. So Len, come on up.
Thank you. My name's Len Nielsen. I'm a forester with CAL FIRE, the Southern Region Forester, in fact, out of Fresno. I was deployed here on December 11th and left sometime in February, I think, is about the duration. So I got here during the fire, reported right away with, connected up with Kevin Cooper and the BEAR team, so then we could transition over to the Watershed Emergency Response Team that actually came about January 1st. His team members started showing, other team members started showing up, and the full team arrived January 2nd when the burn severity map had been completed. That burn severity map that Kevin mentioned starts the ball rolling for the debris potential map, which shows us, as he showed in his slides, where the highest hazards will likely occur for during high rainfall intensities, storms. So that's where we started as a team, but in this event, in this assignment, we started early and we coordinated together right from the get-go, which made this almost seamless when we went from the Forest Service area onto private lands, such as in Montecito. So it was really a very successful event in that regard. So what do we do with the Watershed Emergency Response Team? We have these goals. We assist the communities and counties that may not have the ologists that are ready to go out and do the assessment right away and in this rapid fashion. And so we bring a team of ologists with us, geologists, hydrologists, engineers, and we come out and we look at these values at risk, or VARs as we call them often, and we identify where they are and what we can do about them, if anything. Sometimes you cannot prevent a 20-foot boulder from rolling down the hill, other than getting out of the way, right? So we develop that. Normally in the process, if we're just not on federal land, we have to develop the soil burn severity map, which we learned how to do from the feds years ago in this process. And then as we move through the process, we identify these recommendations, such as the early warning system and the evacuation areas and things like that. We develop and advise the county or the communities as to what those values at risk are. This is an example of a soil burn severity map. This is the Montecito area right here. You can see it's low and moderate in here, and even though it's low and moderate, it still has a lot of vegetation that is gone. So while we mentioned that the roots of the soil, as they burn, and the more the roots burn, the higher the severity is captured. In the Montecito area, it was overall it was considered low and moderate, but that still means that the vegetation went away. So that raindrop inception doesn't occur, and that water gathers much faster and comes down the hill with a lot more velocity. That velocity picks up more and more rock and debris and becomes the debris slide, where the debris flows. So we do this through a quick way. We do what's called a burn area reflectance classification map, which is kind of a before and after vegetation. Then we ground truth it. The federal team and the state team, we ground truth the area. And then we develop the soil burn severity map, and then from there is the potential map. That's kind of the process. Again, it wasn't available really until January 2nd, but once we had January 2nd, we were already out in the field with about 28 people. Is that right? About 28 people for the team, where we covered Ventura County and Santa Barbara County. The big thing with the watershed response team is that we do a rapid assessment. We start what we call time zero, which is right now getting ready for a winter storm. Usually we don't have a winter storm such as severe as the January 9th event, but we engaged on the 2nd with the counties, and before then even, I had come up to the EOC and engaged with Rob Lewin and his team, and there was no introduction or introduction phase with our team because we already had that relationship built. Again, we give them recommendations as to what they can do in the situation that they're in. We do a field evaluation. That field evaluation goes up into creek channels, as you can see on the top left here. Ologists going up the creek channel to see what size of the material is that had come down previously to the debris slide. One of the things that we noticed early in the evaluation is that Montecito is built on what's called an alluvial fan, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. But as we look at the hazards and for life hazards and property hazards in the environment, we assess them and we give them kind of a scoring of a high, low, or high, medium, or low. And we give that in a table in the work report and in one of the appendix, so you can see all 178 for the Santa Barbara County. So you saw one of these slides in Kevin's report as well. We have it in ours. It's a description of the types of geology in the area that we see and that we saw specifically in this area. Of course, we see rock fall from the steep slopes. We see the wildfire, the rain on the wildfire, where it will cause these debris slide slopes. We see the floodplains down in like Carpinteria. And of course, we see the alluvial fan like in Montecito. So Montecito, most of Montecito is built on this yellow section and in the beginning of the steeper areas of the hill slope. Because of the way the orientation of these with the weather patterns that come in, you have the potential to have these intense rainstorms that come and unleash a lot of water in a short period of time, which we were able to identify that and identify that as a hazard, which is what we passed on to the counties to say, hey, this is going to be an issue. This alluvial fan, when it releases the debris slide, when that builds up, as that debris builds up and becomes bigger and bigger in bulks, as it hits a choke point or a place like a bridge or a roadway where the debris gets caught up, or a house in some cases, it builds up and then it goes in a different direction than the normal or natural channel. And it can create its new channel or go into an old relic channel or a low-lying area, which is what we saw occur during the 1/9 event, which is very difficult to predict because you never know exactly how high that bulking will occur, where that obstruction will occur, and what will cause that obstruction. It could be a tree, it could be a bridge, culvert, it could be just a bend in the creek. So you don't know exactly where that's going to be, and so it's really difficult to predict where it's going to bulk and then go in a new direction. So in generally, that's why we have these larger polygons that we've identified to say these are areas that are dangerous, because we don't know where it's going to go on that alluvial fan. Again, here's from the probability prediction model. You see the different colors associated with the amount of sediment that's estimated to come out during that 15-minute rainfall event that we talked about earlier, 24 millimeters of rain. And so we look at these and say, okay, this is the Cold Springs, this is San Ysidro, this is Montecito Creek, the basins. All of these have large watersheds behind what you can kind of see when you look at the town. And so all of that energy potential that's happening over behind the mountain still comes out through those narrow canyons and then comes out onto the alluvial fan of Montecito. This map, I clipped this off of a bigger map so I could blow up. It's actually quite large. This should be around January 3rd. Oh, January 16th of 2018. Yep, right there. Yep. Yep. So these were some of the tables. This is a table that's in the work report also that has the estimated amount of debris flow volume by the basins. And in the previous slide, there are numbers. They're really hard to see, but these are numbers, and they correlate with that data table as to how many yards of sediment that was expected to come out during that type of rainfall. Now, the rainfall event that we did have was a lot larger than the threshold amount, but we have to start and at least have a measuring stick, and that's why we use that 15-minute period. And then, of course, some of the identified hazards are these choke points or these areas that we know have had problems in the past and or will likely be problems during that type of rainfall intensity and debris slide event, such as these bridges where we have infrastructure built in or within the built environment. You see in here you have a culvert that's coming in here, some cement coming in this channel, some railing, and then over in this slide you have a gas line and a water line that's down here along the roadway. All of those are impacted during the debris slide events and the flooding events. They may be punctured. We had a gas line explode during the 1/9 event. You know, lots of infrastructure gets destroyed during these also, because the debris slide is not just water, it's dirt, mud, rocks, trees, cars, houses. This is a before and after, and we took after the debris slide this before, we went out and identified this as a potential choke point during the initial assessments. Then we came back afterwards and took a picture of the same bridge. You can see how it's been filled in with sediment as not necessarily expected, because nobody really expected a 5-minute rainstorm at just over ½ inch, but we did expect to see debris slides and flooding. So the main takeaways from the work report, included some general recommendations. Each value at risk has mitigation measures or potential mitigation measures that the county can partake in, and they have done a lot of them already. But early evacuation, and I should say early evacuation and often. Unfortunately, during the winter, we can expect often evacuations for the area because of the high risk of the probability and potential. The potential is the hillside, and the probability is the rainstorm. So it's really important, of course, for the community, as most of you are now aware of the weather and what's going on with the weather. Most of us have the WIA and the weather alerts attached to our hips on our cell phones and our computers and devices, so we get that right away now. So that's one good improvement for the area. Debris removal from the debris basins, that's huge. We know that most of those debris basins overtopped, so at least the amount of debris that went into those basins stayed in those basins. Now, yeah, they overtopped, but they did capture some. Imagine what it would be like without it. Protective structure installation, such as K-rails and debris catchments or diversions. That's what that means. If you're going to have a small debris slide, you can put in things like that to kind of direct the debris back into the channel if you know it's going to hit a low spot, such as go onto a roadway and then down the road into somebody's driveway. Sandbags count as those also, to keep it to go back into the natural channel. And signage, we see now, flooding ahead or flooding potential all over town now. And of course, storm patrols during the event to see if there's anything going on, and even devices in the channels, which were part of the recommendations. And of course, again, there was 178 values at risk identified during the process for Santa Barbara County. There was another, I think, 192 for Ventura County. The report is together in one because it was one event, as it was just one fire, the Thomas Fire. And it's available online at sbc.com or .org. And you can look up the Thomas Fire WERT, and it will come up also. And then I'll take questions at the end. Matt?
Thank you, Len. Appreciate the information. Next, we have Eric Simmons from FEMA, who's going to be coming up here to provide a little bit of information on the process and timeline for the new flood hazard mapping, something that we're all anxious and ready to hear. So, turn it over to you.
Great. My name is Eric Simmons. I'm an engineer with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So very happy to be here to talk about hazard mapping, in that FEMA has started a recovery map project for the county. And it's important to realize, and I think we've seen today, how these efforts are very much in partnership. It's not one agency alone. It's many federal, state, and local agencies working together for common mission. And I want to just introduce this project. It started on the FEMA end. FEMA's hired a contractor to do much of the technical work. And we can see some of the background there, but what does the recovery maps mean for you? So I'll have a couple slides on what that is and what the mapping is and how FEMA is doing the analyses and the timeline. And where will we be developing these recovery maps? So you can see from this graphic, it's for the watersheds starting on the west from the city of Santa Barbara to the east to the Ventura County boundary. So for our modeling purposes, we're dividing these streams and watersheds into 6 major areas. And how will this data be used? What's the primary purpose? So the mapping is going to show a high hazard area, okay? And that is going to show the water surface elevations associated with a 1% annual chance rainfall, considering these post-burn conditions with the post-burn watersheds. And the primary purpose, the reason why FEMA is doing that, is to inform the rebuilding efforts. So one of the cornerstones of FEMA is called mitigation. It's our efforts to reduce future losses, to build back safer after events, or to build safer in the beginning. And so these maps will show a high hazard area, and they will show the recovery map elevations, that is, water surface elevations. And this data will be used to inform the rebuilding process. It's important to note that the recovery maps do not impact flood insurance. So separate and under the National Flood Insurance Program, there's a flood insurance rate map for every county, so including Santa Barbara. And that map, the flood insurance rate map, is used for the rating of flood insurance. The recovery maps will not impact flood insurance. The county has adopted the current flood insurance rate map for Santa Barbara. And it's important to note that in many cases, these recovery maps will show higher water surface elevations, and that will be used to build back safer. Hit the wrong button. Okay, so the timeline. We're here today, first day of May, and these engineering analyses, the modeling is ongoing. So engineers and GIS analysts are doing this work. They're doing the analysis, the hydrology and hydraulics. And our goal, and we will be providing the draft data set to the county late this month. And in June, that data will be made widely available. And I'll have a slide on how that is. Will be all done digitally and available online. And looking at that technical approach, so we're going to be focused on the post-burn hydrology. So that is looking at existing conditions the hazard today, and we're developing hydraulic models for these watersheds. And we're using the latest modeling that will analyze in two-dimensional ways. We heard and we saw previously how the flow paths are uncertain. So today's models allow us to understand where the flow will go, where these large events may inundate. And there'll be multiple products produced. There'll be, with the flood recovery maps, a paper set that some people could use. But we'll also have that data online. So it'll be available through a map viewer. So with a link the county can provide, really anybody can look and see what the recovery maps show for their particular property. The models also produce grid data, that is regularly spaced interval data that shows the recovery map elevations as well as the depths. And that depths is important because it will show, it's a rating of the risk. Okay. And it's important to note that FEMA will be using topographic data that's post-19. That is, the topographic data was acquired about a week after the debris flow event. So LIDAR is a technology. It stands for light detection and ranging. It's a technology where a sensor is placed in a plane and sends out literally thousands of points a second. And so we have highly detailed and very accurate measurements of the ground surface. And this LIDAR data will reflect the post-debris elevations and ground conditions. And we develop hydrologic modeling to understand the flow rates in these watersheds. So the FEMA's contractor is using the HEC HMS program, and considering the post-burn conditions, we'll be assessing flow rates in these different watersheds. And those flow rates are put into a hydraulic model. The hydraulic model is HEC RAS, a river analysis system. And that program, again, is a two-dimensional model, so it allows us to understand where the actual flows will go during a major event. The ground condition in those models, again, we'll be using that light detection and ranging topographic data, and that reflects the post-debris events. And we will be assuming that most of the culverts and bridges will be blocked, as they actually were during the event. And that will impact the high hazard area, where it'll flow, and how deep the elevations will get. So we're mostly done with that hydraulic modeling effort. These are pretty intense models. Takes hours and hours to run, even with our best computers. But they produce really detailed and precise results. And this other data, so it'll show the water surface elevations, both in a gridded format or in lines. And then depth grids. That is, it shows the areas of deeper flooding or shallower flooding based on this 1% annual chance rainfall event. So here in this graphic, you can see the channel is deeper, different color, and then it's shallower in the overbanks. Okay. So we'll have this data online next month, and we'll also have maps that we could, bring to a public meeting like this or have in someone's office. Here's a template. We don't actually have the maps done yet, but here's a template of what it may look like. And again, just want to stress why FEMA, why we're working together to do this. I work in the mitigation division of FEMA, and really our goal is to sustain efforts, reduce future losses. And we know, based on studies, that these investments multiply. That is, money spent now will save much more money later. So we're really encouraged with our partnership with the county to build back safer and stronger. As an engineer, That's what I want to hear, and it's great that this partnership is occurring. So here's the timeline again. We covered that slide, and just some contacts. So there's contacts at the county. As an engineer, there's my email. I'm happy to be joined by the flood insurance specialist for my region, FEMA Region 9, Edie Lohman, and she's here today to answer questions about flood insurance also. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Eric. We really appreciate that presentation. As everyone can see, there's a lot of technology and there's a lot of technical aspects to the things that have been going on since last December. And I can tell you that I've seen these gentlemen in our Emergency Operations Center late at night after days in the field and working hard and working together, and appreciate all that cooperation that you heard about earlier. So with that, I think we can now open up the floor to some questions. On each side of our aisle here, we've got some microphones, or if you prefer to write a question, we've got some note cards on a table in the back, and our staff can gather the cards and I can read the questions out loud. For the audience watching at home on Facebook Live, you can submit the questions and staff can get those over to me. In addition to our speakers here tonight that you've heard, we also have Edie Lohman from FEMA that we just talked about a second ago. She's with the National Flood Insurance portion of FEMA. Tom Fayram and John Fry from our Flood Control District are here tonight. Rob Lewin, the Director of OEM, is here as well. And Diane Black, our Planning and Development Director, is here. So with that, I'd like to open it up to some questions, and we can get you some answers. Supervisor Williams, I see you by a microphone back there. Do you have a question for us tonight?
Yes. Because this, Mr. Simmons, this question is for you. Because this is such a, I suppose, politically connected community, rumors have abound about what threshold that you will use. And so seeing your slides was the biggest relief that I've had in at least a month. So you are confirming that the threshold that you are going to use is not a 1,000-year event, not a 500-year event, not a 200-year event, but a 100-year event.
Yes, that's correct. So some people call it a 100-year event. At FEMA, we like to call it a 1% annual chance event because that chance happens each and every year. It's not like you have a major event and you're safe for 99 years. So that's a nationwide standard. It's a nationwide standard that's adopted, regardless of regional preference, as a basis for the National Flood Insurance Program and floodplain management in general.
And sort of the follow-up, is that a 1% flood risk or a 1% debris flow risk, or is there a difference?
Well, the recovery maps are a hazard map. So in that hazard, there's flood or debris. We're modeling water surface elevations based on this rainfall and the post-burn hydrology that can also consider the debris.
Hi there. My name is Marshall Miller. It was a question for FEMA representative also.
You can probably stay up here for a few minutes. Good spot.
The examples of kind of bridges and roads and homes that you showed up there were examples of county roads and local homes and whatnot. Could you speak specifically to the issue of the 101 and what the interface would be either with Federal Department of Transportation or Caltrans in terms of how do we get boulders from the mountains to the ocean and ergo under the 101 freeway? Because that's an issue on all of the sections you talked about. And then, I'm sorry, my second question is the volume of our debris basins and the volume of potential debris that you have modeled coming out of each of these canyons. If one is plus and one is minus, do these equal? Does the volume that can be brought into a debris basin have a mathematical parity with the potential volume coming out as you all have modeled? So, sorry, those are two questions, but.
You want to take it first? Okay, since I'm focused on the recovery mapping effort, I think the debris questions.
So on the debris basins and the amount of predicted sediment coming out, there is a plus and minus effect that occurs depending on the size of the event. You know, the debris basins are engineered to take up so many up to so many cubic yards of sediment. If the event is larger than, of course, it overfills the cup, right? So it depends on the size of the event. So we don't know how big the event is going to be. We do know the potential of the basin during a certain size storm, but that's an estimation. And what actually comes down could be plus or minus. And you know, ideally, those basins, when they're empty, they do a lot of good, and they don't do any harm.
I'd like to follow up on that. Again, I'm Tom Faber. I'm with the Flood Control District. So on those debris basins, we've had those questions before. You have to keep in mind that particularly the ones above Montecito, Cold Springs, San Ysidro, and Romero, were all built after prior fires as emergency projects built by the Corps of Engineers. So it wasn't a mathematical equation of what do we think the volume should be for a given watershed size. It was an emergency placement of a basin based on the topography and the configuration that was available, and you did the best you could. And now I'll transition to the example of what was designed for the watershed was the Santa Monica Creek Basin, which is a very large basin and was designed not after an emergency, but was an actual watershed project that was built deliberately and engineered to a specific size.
So Tom, I have total respect for all the work that you've done, but since this was the first time, and so we're grateful for what we have, but in terms of informing our community going forward, we had that multicolored slide that showed each canyon and some sort of potential to drop debris that was a volumetric measurement. Is it reasonable to assume that the current debris basins we have are not adequately sized relative to what that map predicts as a potential volumetric flow?
Absolutely, and I would say they weren't designed for that event either. But yes, clearly, I mean, in the cases that we've seen, the Cold Springs and San Ysidro, those basins were overtopped by 20, 30 feet over the top of the spillway. So they were overwhelmed by the magnitude of that event. But we are looking at now of options to improve those. I don't see
go into that, Tom, if you can.
Okay, so we are going to be moving forward, at least initially with those three that I mentioned, to look at options for improving those, either increasing the size, improving the operability by preferably trapping only the rocks and not the sediment. We don't want debris basins, wasted space when you trap sediment. That needs to flow to the ocean. We want the rocks, and so we're looking at options for doing that. But those will not be to the size of Santa Monica. And but that said, in the short term, we want to do what we can and try to improve the operation of those. And it's going to be difficult because where those basins are, they're already in a tight canyon. And so, but that said, we're going to look and see what options are, particularly in San Ysidro, which is the smallest of those three. We recognize and long have recognized that that's a small basin for the watershed, but it's in a very tight canyon and very difficult access by roadway too, which is a problem when it comes to cleaning them out.
Mr. Pontus, can I add something? And with us today is Ed Demensa from the Army Corps. Maybe he can stand up for a minute here. And the Army Corps is coming forward to help us out in looking at the studying what we can do, what improvements we can make to our protection systems, the debris basins. And so, and of course, if he wants to add anything, I guess maybe.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Tom. You've seen a lot of the information that's already been developed. the assumptions that that is being used by FEMA right now is to look at close to the worst conditions, so that the local planning efforts will be to the level that would be able to respond to a subsequent event. What we would be doing is a model or two that will reflect more of what would be expected in the futures, in the years to come, and this will be the sort of model that will allow us to identify what is the optimal size for those basins. As Tom had indicated, these basins were developed after some events, essentially as an emergency action, not necessarily designed based on a certain event, and that's what we would be doing. We will be taking a lot of the information that's already been developed to date, the work that's being done by All-Star and FEMA, and we will pull together a core model that will allow us to develop the appropriate design, the appropriate size for different expected events, and we will present that to the county for consideration. We would also look for any opportunities where the Corps of Engineers could help and implement those projects. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question in the back.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Jacques Marsac, Montecito resident. I had a question for FEMA and the mapping. Is there any preliminary indication you can give that as an overall average about how much the new base flood elevation is relative to the existing base flood elevation on the books? I know it would change over the profile, but just, is it 100%, 200%, 10%? Any preliminary generalizations you can give us?
Okay, so in terms of the recovery map elevations, which have yet to be calculated, and how they compare with base flood elevations on a flood insurance rate map, I don't have that data yet because we haven't done that modeling, but we have done the hydrologic analyses. That is, looked at the flow rates, considering the post-burn conditions. And, if you want to pick up a rough number, those flow rates are about twice of what they are pre-burn.
That wouldn't translate linearly into elevation being 2 times as high, though, in general for the
correct. It does not translate that way. Right. So that's why we do this very detailed, rigorous modeling to see how high that elevation is and the extent of that high hazard zone.
And a second question on when these maps come out and we can see how detailed and technical they are, what would your opinion, and maybe the flood control district can chime in as well, what would your opinion be on the value of a public comment period, or how could the public actually comment and would lead to any substantive changes in your maps?
Okay. For the flood insurance rate maps, there's a extensive statutory due process. We're not having a comment period for the recovery maps. They're intended for a short term for the recovery period. We do realize that the flood insurance rate maps are now definitely outdated. The ground has changed. That's why we're here doing these analyses. When we get to that point for an update of the flood insurance rate map, which we have yet to fund and still need to plan out, there'll be multiple comment periods, and those are set in policy and in statute.
Okay, thank you.
So if I could just chime on that as well to help get to your second part of your question there. Certainly the county is going to be coming out as soon as we get the maps, and we'll have another forum like this to share the maps, share some of the new data so we can all look at it and have some comments and certainly be part of that community process. So look for that. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Ray Farrar, and I'm a Montecito resident. A couple of questions. One is, what is the timing in terms of the new firm that'll be issued by FEMA?
I'm sorry, the new firm?
The flood insurance rate map?
Oh, that firm. Oh, I'll go ahead. That firm. I'll give that back to Eric.
So we haven't started an update to the flood insurance rate map. It's typically a 4 or 5 year process. So it's at least 5 years out.
So then the existing flood map will be used for insurance purposes and rating purposes in terms of policies?
Correct.
For 5 years?
Well, again, yes. There's always small revisions or amendments that happen thousands of times a year, and those continue. But you know, a watershed scale study.
Are you talking about letter of map changes, or?
Yes, I'm talking about.
But those are driven by individual property owners, particularly, or right?
Typically,
okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, second question. So for 5 years, I'm understanding that those flood insurance rates will remain the same, roughly 5 years.
Well, I can't read, you know, the will of Congress on how insurance rates may change. We do have an insurance specialist, but the rate map is not changing now.
Okay. And then second question would be, I want to know more about the interface between public and private watersheds and how they relate to our county management, floodplain management. And, you know, because I see that much of the watershed in Montecito is privately owned creeks, and whether or not there's debris removal going on and how that's managed, given the fact that we're all taxpayers, we all pay similar property tax rates, and yet we have different services based on whether or not we consider the creek private or public.
So that was a good question. So Ray, let me first of all extend it over to Edie real quick. Maybe you can add a little bit to Eric's comments on the insurance question, and then we'll let Mr. Fayrum help out on the other private and public watershed question.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So Eric's correct. So your flood insurance requirements from your lender, for those of you that have lenders on your property, really use the current FEMA flood insurance rate maps, and we also use those maps for rating purposes so that we can get a grasp on the underwriting. The rates are updated just broadly in this program once a year. Some go up, some go down, so there are inflationary adjustments. But I think your question is more, is there going to be a change in rates because something is changing with the maps in Santa Barbara County? And the answer to that is no.
Great.
So then on to the question of the creek corridors. So I should probably preface that by saying Santa Barbara County is quite different than most other counties in California. And in fact, most other counties almost despise the level of service that we do provide, because most county flood control districts will not work on private property, period. It has to be a constructed, improved, publicly owned facility for that agency to work on that. Santa Barbara County has had a long history of maintaining natural stream courses that are mostly on private property. However, there's a limit to what can be done. I think one of the things we've said is, you know, we can do almost anything, but we can't do everything. And even in Montecito, there is such an extreme network of streams and tributaries and into backyards that the main backbone stream corridors from the ocean roughly to East Valley has been our historic area of doing work. Even with that, with this last event, the amount of debris was so great that we couldn't have even afforded to remove that. And if it weren't for FEMA tasking the Corps of Engineers, the stream removal was, I believe, was $30 million alone. The debris basins were about $80 million. So it puts the scale of that in. But in routine
and Tom, tell people what your yearly budget is.
And our annual budget here on the South Coast is on the order of $6 million, $7 million. And our reserves are nowhere able to, we simply could not have done the debris basins and the stream clearing. So that puts it into perspective of then what we try to do is focus on the work that has the broadest regional benefit to the community. And that tends to keep us out of people's backyards. That benefits one property owner to that extent, but those mainstream corridors, we worked almost every inch of that, either with the Corps or on our own after 1/9.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Got another question in the back.
I'm Stephen Carlson, I'm a Montecito resident. The recovery map, does that take into consideration what the current debris basins are and their capacity? And my second question would be, would we be making changes to those debris basins or adding debris basins that would change the recovery map requirements?
Thank you for the question. We're going to let Tom Farum answer that question.
So I think the flow rate that FEMA looks at does not discount any capture by the debris basins. And I think that's accurate given what we saw is that the amount of capture doesn't discount it. Now, if those basins are improved and there can be a detection of a difference, like Santa Monica clearly was an example. But to that extent, I don't think we should mislead anybody and think we're going to have multiple Santa Monica style debris basins across this. It's just simply not, there's not enough money to do that. Those are extraordinarily expensive. So I think the short answer to your question is probably not. Maybe Eric would want to comment on that, but you don't have a discount for the debris basins, which I think is the appropriate way to do that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Curtis Skeen, I'm a Montecito resident. Will future flood-related or debris-related evacuation maps be using the fire evacuation maps, or are there going to be new ones made?
I'm Robert Lewin, the Director of the Office of Emergency Management. So the maps that we're going to continue to use are going to be the maps that show the risk areas that we're currently using for the evacuations that we've done post 1/9 debris flow. However, we're hoping that we can get those maps looked at again based on some factors that have changed. The fact that the debris basins are empty and the channels are clear. Those maps were based on a map done by some folks that are here today from the State Watershed Task Force. And so with the improvements that are made, we're hoping that we'll be able to refine some of those polygons so that, you know, some properties may be able to be taken out of the red areas. We're also going to take a look at the burn area and the buffer around the burn area to see if we can make any changes to that going into the next winter season. As you heard earlier, one of the things that has come out in the information sharing today is that the growth is slow up on the Thomas Burn area. And we were hoping that we would be able to approach the next winter season with second-year growth, what we refer to as second-year growth, which would have improved the conditions and raised the thresholds for evacuations. Unfortunately, it looks like we just did not get enough moisture in this continuing drought that we're in. And so, but we will be coming back and meeting with USGS and with the scientists this summer in August when we get the latest data from the forest and others and taking a hard evaluation of the thresholds, of the evacuation maps, and try to look and determine what modifications we can have to improve what we're doing and hopefully modify them so they're not as impactful. But at this point, we're not particularly optimistic with the information on the slow growth.
So if I can, let me rephrase the question a bit. Will debris-related evacuation maps be north to south along the creeks that the debris and the mud and the water flow, or will the evacuation maps be east to west, which is what the fire maps are?
So yes, I think I understood your question correctly. In the evacuations we did post 1/9, the additional 3 were done based on the water courses, the burn area, and the buffer area around the burn area, as well as the flood, 100-year flood areas in the lowlands. So we'll include all 3 of those as we have in the next year, and of course, into the future. And I think one of the important things I'd like to also bring up is that we're talking a lot about debris flows, but we also have a flood hazard. And I know this is maybe a nuance, but the potential for flooding is also greatly increased. So a non-debris flow type flooding, because the burn area now does not retain the water that it would have when it had vegetation on it. So even without a debris flow, if we had a long duration storm that was continually raining, we can have flooding. So that, of course, is another thing that we're also keeping our eyes on in this process.
Thank you.
Thank you. I am Oscar Sepulveda. I've been a resident of Montecito since 1996. Perhaps my question is a little bit too personal, but since I am already here, I decided to go ahead and ask it anyway. I would like to see if our county supervisor and the representative from the Planning Commission can answer my question. Until very recently, the request for the installation or modification of any air conditioning system was a very easy process. Very easy process, and I will say also it wasn't very expensive. Surprisingly enough, my contractor came to pull the permits and realized that the game had changed drastically. Why is it personal to me? As a result of a medical diagnosis of a terminal disease, the quality of the air around my property, and particularly inside the house, is extremely important. I understand now it has become a very burdensome process. They have added 2 new requirements. First of all, they are asking for a structural engineer report and assessment of the attic of the property, because that's where the units are going to be. A process that, of course, is very expensive. Also, they are demanding, and this is a must, a new drawing, architectural version of my property, including all the adjacent areas, and it had to be on an 11 by 17 paper. No other paper is accepted. And also, even though we do have the blueprints from the original house, plus we have the updated blueprints of any update that have been done in my property, they are not acceptable. That will add an extra $1,500 to my project, which is in excess of $30,000 already. So far, the permits, based on the requirement that the county is imposing on us, is the most expensive in the state of California. As a matter of fact, it's twice as expensive. So I would like to get an answer on why. All I heard was this attitude about helping the people, expediting whatever they could, whatever the improvement they needed in order to mitigate some of the impact on our life. I would like to know, first of all, why these new requirements have been imposed on us, and secondly, what type of input or what type of community feedback was taken into account before it was approved. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I'll say that the ordinance that we are proposing is meant to expedite rebuilding. It is not meant to expedite any improvement that people are making on their property. I, on the board, initiated a discussion of a like-for-like ordinance that would allow people who have lost their homes to be able to rebuild their homes in the same size as the previous home. But unlike previous like-for-like ordinances, we would not restrict it only to the site of that building, because if it got knocked down by the debris flow, that's not a good place to have a building. But to allow that building envelope to be moved away from the creek and to higher ground. But the scope of that ordinance is not to affect all properties in Montecito. It is not to affect any improvements that people are making on their property. It is only to help people rebuild a home in close to the same size as the previous home. And I'll say one thing about fees before I turn it over to our planning director, because I don't know anything about a specific air conditioning application. But I will tell you that we did make a policy decision on fees that's based off of my experience at the city of Santa Barbara, which is just that process, in my experience, costs more than fees. So that it makes no sense for an agency to understaff itself in an effort to keep fees low, that all it does is make people pay longer for delays. And so we have made the policy decision that all fees are 100% cost recovery, unsubsidized. And of course, if we did not make that policy decision, then we'd have less money to be able to respond to emergency issues that could be this year or next. But you may have I do want to give our planning director a chance to, because I've only addressed part of your question, and that's the parts of the question I know about.
So thank you. I'm Diane Black. I'm going to give you my business card because I think your question is really specific, and I think it'd be better if we just talked about it in the office or by phone. Okay.
I agree with you.
I will do that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Matt, we have a couple questions that have come online.
That's great.
That I'd like to interject. Caltrans is not here tonight, but I'll still throw the question out. What is the status, if anyone here in the room can answer, the status of the bridges that are closed that were impacted? Do we have someone who can answer?
Rob Lewin, I'll try to give a little bit of information. So the good thing is that Caltrans is operating on repairing the bridges under an emergency permit, so they're moving fast. As we all have heard, there's 6 bridges, and 2 of them need repair, and 4 of them need to be replaced. And they have worked out a good relationship with the utilities that also use those bridges to convey their either electricity or natural gas or water over those bridges, and so so now they're able to move forward on replacing those. So I don't have the details on when they're going to be completed, but it's moving faster than a project by far would under a normal Caltrans project. And they're also trying to make sure that they're providing, making the bridges so that they will have increased capacity, but not necessarily the capacity that would not be blocked by a debris flow. I don't want to imply that, but it will have more capacity, and they will be designed with the idea that they should fit into the Montecito community.
So thank you, Rob. That's a good answer, and that's what we're hearing on the street. But we'll go ahead and contact Caltrans as well and get a situation status update and post that on our readysbc.org.
We can also include it in our recovery e-news. So if anyone hasn't registered yet, we have a new newsletter that goes out by email that you can register from the county of SB or from readysbc.org, either way. Or contact one of us. We're happy to help you get registered for that. My second question, I'll paraphrase. The question is about the debris that was removed to areas outside of Montecito. And so, quote, Montecito, it's been phrased or referenced that Montecito should handle its own mud. But why is this not a U.S. forest mud? And why don't they remove it off public and private property?
So thank you for that question.
I'm just reading the question.
No, appreciate that. So
Don't
difficult
shoot the
question
messenger.
to answer. And I'm not going to put our Forest Service representative on the hook on that one. It is difficult, more difficult to get the dirt up the hill than it is to bring it down, clearly. But you know, that's one of the things. We've had a lot of questions on that over the last couple months, and we continue to work with Forest Service on, you know, a lot of the mitigation projects that we're going to be pulling together, hopefully within the next 30 days, and bringing back in front of the community. And hopefully some of those will help us get through the discussions on rock and mud and what to do to prevent it from coming down as it did on the 1-9 event.
I have one more, since we don't have anyone standing in line at the microphones. Okay, so I'm reading this, so bear with me. The radar readings were taken from January 20th when the creeks were still full, as well as the debris basins. Current elevations are now lower. Would that change the LiDAR readings if taken today? Is it possible that this overstates the impact of any future storm?
That's a good question. Thank you for bringing it up. I'm going to have Len from CAL FIRE come up here and talk just a little bit more about LiDAR, perhaps, and the differences in timing, or unless Eric's jumping at this one. All right.
So yeah, the acronym is LiDAR, stands for Light Detection and Ranging. And it's a little bit like sonar, but it actually uses pulses of light, so a laser from an airplane. It can penetrate shallow water. So if you can imagine, water you can see through, or, but again, we don't live in the Pacific Northwest where our streams are full. So the modeling, the hydraulic modeling that we use has that bare earth layer, because the light would bounce off of anything. So if it bounces off a tree, part of it might do that, but we process it to that bare earth. So we're confident it reflects the bare earth that was there when the plane was flown about a week after the event. But we also know, channels were cleared, debris basins. But when another major event happens, we believe those channels would again silt up and fill with debris. So we feel it's an accurate representation of the hazard.
So the short answer is yes. There is sediment that's detected that's in that channel when that was flown or when the plane went over. However, like Eric said, that will likely be the case when and if it happens again. So the LiDAR really depicts where the low-lying areas are and identifies where the potential for the debris may go next time. And that's the real big bang for the buck.
Hi, Denise Adams, Montecito resident. I had two questions. The first one I think got asked, but I would like to underscore it again. I really think many of us want to understand why CAL FIRE and the Forest Service doesn't take the mud back, because all of us are concerned. Insurance policies don't cover that. And we're all worried about what happens to us if we're next. And that decision is a very priority decision for all of us to know what happens when the next debris fall comes, and why, if it's not our mud, do we have to pay to remove it because of something many of us have not budgeted. So I hope we get an answer from CAL FIRE and the Forest Service on the mud, because I understand from the Board of Supervisors meeting from, I think it was Janet Wolf and Supervisor Hartman, they don't want it on their beaches and we don't want it in our homes, and insurance doesn't pay to remove it. So that's a big question. My second question is very basic. When today I had 3 alert messages about the rain, but where do I go online or in the county to find the historical rain charts? Where do I find charts that'll tell me how often it's rained in the past to the level of 1 inch per hour or 1.5 inches per hour? I can remember being on the freeway in 1992. I can remember 95. I can remember December 31st, 1999. But those are 4 or 5 year intervals. How often does this happen, and where do I go find greater specificity? The county says by month. It doesn't say by date, and it doesn't say how fast and how hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Adams. So on your first question, certainly, the discussion, like I said, is ongoing on our additional sediment that could be coming down off the mountain, and we continue to have that discussion. internally within our flood control district, Tom and his team are worried about that also, just because it fills up the debris basins. And like we talked about earlier, where the supervisor was talking about, our financial means to be able to clear those things out, and they're trying to do it immediately. As soon as we get any kind of sediment in those debris basins, to get out there with the crews and get those things cleaned out, it presents a daunting challenge for all of us. So thank you for the question on that. And in terms of the historical rainfall data, proud to turn this one over to Mr. Fayrum and his team again, because they have some pretty amazing stuff on their website that you can query. So Tom?
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the challenges we have is there's so much information out there that an individual person might not know exactly where to go to get it. So how about if we do this? Anybody who's interested in that, when we're done here, I'll do it right on the screen. And there is information down to 5 minutes to hourly. You'll be surprised at the information that's available throughout the county. So if you think that's a good idea, Matt, we'll just congregate over at the computer when we're done here, and then you can take that address and go home and have at it.
That's great. Next question.
Announcement.
Good evening. My name is Michelle Drum, and as most of you know, the County of Santa Barbara has a community wellness team. And part of that community wellness team is California Hope 805. And there are 15 of us who are crisis counselors who are here actually at the Montecito Center, ready to support anyone in the community that has been directly or indirectly affected by the disasters. And we know that this is a lot of information and that the recovery process is very lengthy. So 5 of us are here tonight, and we'll be hanging out if you have any questions. We have the ability to do emotional support as well as resources and referrals, so we're here for you.
Thank you, Mrs. Drum, and thank you for bringing that to our attention tonight, and we appreciate all 5 of you being here tonight to help us get through this. We also have, as she mentioned, staff at our Montecito Center on Coast Village Road that are down there every day and talking to a lot of folks, and we're getting a lot of positive feedback on your guys' efforts, so thank you very much for your team.
We don't have anyone. Oh, we have one more question. I think I wanted to say after we let this gentleman ask his question, if there's anyone in the audience who just didn't want to get up and come to the microphone, but you have a question, we can also bring the microphone to you. So when we're done with this next question, raise your hand. We want to make sure everyone has a chance. So we'll go.
Hi there, Phil Walker. I'm a resident of the East Side. 2 real quick points. March 10th, 1995, my wife's grandma's, the family home was severely flooded when Sycamore Creek overtopped. It log jammed at the Cacique Bridge, and there were a lot of problems with the big blue gums that had come down that acted as a log jam essentially. And Sycamore Creek blew in the back door and ran out the front door when they just got the KYT flood alert. But a gentleman who was also a real first responder had the fire axe, and that's back when the sound wall at the RV park area was wood. And he saved lives by punching through with that fire axe and letting the water drain out. Okay, one other quick thing. I'm sure the Bear report has covered it, the possibility of using or not using hydromulching, like I know they're using the rice straw, which seems very effective. It even has an emulsifier in it, I understand, and it sort of glues the hillside back together. Would that help with the vitrification that that caused the hydrophobia of the soil? Thank you.
So thank you, sir. And with that, I'm going to bring Kevin up. We get this question very often on some of these mitigations, and he's going to talk a little bit about what that particular solution does and where it works well and where it doesn't.
Yeah, thank you for that question about hydromulching and different slope treatments that we've used in the past. You probably remember, like on some of the Gap Fire and Jesuita Fire, that you've seen.
I've been around since the Coyote.
Right,
fire,
so you've probably seen a lot of it happen on and off.
3 years in the U.S. Army for good behavior.
Okay, good.
I was never called sir. I was enlisted. Thank you.
So there's some limitations to that. I mean, it's effective on slopes that aren't too steep,
Yeah.
which is just up to approximately 60%. And if it gets beyond that, all of those treatments are able to wash off those slopes. And those are the slopes that start off our debris flows. And so if we thought about this right afterwards and talked about it. And so any type of hydromulch that we would have put on there would have been washed off long before a debris flow would have been initiated.
Due to the gradient.
It's not the kind of treatment that would have been effective for this. Unfortunately, these slopes are very, very steep, and that kind of treatment wouldn't work. On slower slopes and on moderate rainfall events, they can be very valuable. Those conditions are not present in these areas that are causing this hazard, so we didn't recommend that.
One other very quick thing, can you use blasting similar to strip mining and create a trench, a rock trap for the boulders? The main thing, the insecurity of living below that with the boulders, I think
Are you speaking in the channels?
Feeling. Yeah.
In the channels themselves?
Channel, you know, like a rock trap for the boulders.
Across the slopes?
Right, like they do in strip mining.
I see what you're saying, kind of like when we...
blasting string.
Right, so we'll undercut a fire line, for instance, to stop burning embers.
If I had all the money in the world, right?
It's very expensive, very difficult, and you're creating many problems with that, of course. With the watershed itself, you're increasing the flood hazard, erosion hazards by getting that heavy equipment up there. So that hazard should be ameliorated once we get that vegetation coming back, and I'm suggesting that on those steep slopes, we would probably loosen more rock than we would prevent from falling down with that kind of approach. But thank you for asking.
Thank you. Appreciate the question. So with that, I don't see any more hands here, but we are going to be sticking around. If you want to come up and talk to some of the scientists and some of our experts, then please make your way up. Thank you for being here tonight. We appreciate the conversation and the questions. And thank you to the agencies who came in tonight, the Forest Service, CAL FIRE, State OES, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and FEMA, and our county departments. So thank you, everyone.